Welcome, everybody. Good evening, everybody. My name is Stephen Weitzman. I'm the director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies, and it's a pleasure to see you all here tonight. Before I introduce the introducer, one practical word and then one note of thanks. There's going to be a book signing right after the conversation, so you probably noticed there are books on sale out in front, but the book signing is going to be in here. So after you buy books or when you have a book, we're going to set up a table probably around the stage right here. Our guest will be behind it, and we need to orderly stand in line so there are no deaths as a result of this conversation. And that's going to last only for a finite amount of time because our guest has to go to San Francisco tonight. So if you're interested in a book signing, please know that's going to happen immediately following the conversation. And the other thing I need to say is I need to thank the sponsor of tonight's event, which is the Jewish Community Endowment Fund, which generously gives the Taube Center funding every year to have events open to the public like this. So please join me in thanking them in absentia for the generosity. So with that, I want to turn things over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Gabriella Safran, who will be introducing our speaker tonight.
Hey, thank you, Steve. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our two conversationalists for tonight. The first one is novelist Gary Shteyngart, Russian Jewish immigrant to the United States. So don't clap yet. I'll let you clap at the end, okay? So he's a Russian Jewish immigrant to the United States, born in Leningrad in 1972. He's the author of 3 amazing, excellent, award-winning novels published in the last 10 years. Russian Debutante's Handbook from 2002, Absurdistan from 2006, and Super Sad True Love Story 2010, each of which is centered on a Russian Jewish immigrant to America born in Leningrad around 1972.
I gotta write something else. Yeah.
So they're incredibly funny, and so as I was rereading them to write this introduction, I was thinking about their humor and wondering, they're comic? Are they comic like a comic strip? And I think in a way they are, but also they aren't. They're sort of located in real history, even though sometimes he tells us that it's a fantastical future. In a lot of ways, it is the history, the time that we live in now. These characters grow and change and age, and so it's not a conventional comic strip. It's maybe something more like Doonesbury, right, where they change. As a professor in Russian literature, something that I really love about Gary Shteyngart's novels is their kind of shameless references to Russian literature, and his willingness to play the role of the Russian in a kind of self-conscious and self-mocking and hilarious way, and his willingness to work with what in Russian you call klukva, which means cranberry, literally, but it also means all of the kind of stereotypes and myths and stories that we believe about Russia, we, foreigners, non-Russians, believe about Russia. Especially, I think, Gary Shteyngart's earlier work is a study in klukva, but not just Russian klukva, but kind of a very specific Russian Jewish klukva. Or maybe Russian Jewish New York City writer klukva, or a kind of 40-year-old who's still attached to paper books even though you shouldn't be anymore klukva. Yeah. And I think what's brilliant is his ability to find these things that we believe, we as a group believe, and we're kind of embarrassed to believe them, but we do. And then his ability to perform these things in this incredible voice in his novels, and the whole performance is funny and embarrassing and hard to put down, maybe impossible to put down. As I was rereading his books for this introduction, and I realized that I would have to write about him in the paper that I was writing for the conference that this this is a part of. So there's something very compelling about them, and I think we're really lucky to have him here tonight. So let's applaud. So Gary Shteyngart will be in conversation tonight with Daniel Schifrin, who is a writer and scholar in San Francisco. He works as the writer-in-residence at the Contemporary Jewish Museum in San Francisco, where he helps develop new exhibitions and projects. I met Daniel in 2007 when he was a visiting scholar here at Stanford, and we talked about our shared secret passion for Russian Jewish revolutionaries. So I can sort of attest that he's, a fascinating scholar as well as a writer and museologist, fun word to say, as well as thinking about Jewish history and culture. He's also the host of the Contemporary Jewish Museum's podcast series, which is called The Space Between, and he writes a monthly column that some of you may read. He writes a column for the J, the Jewish News Weekly of Northern California, and also for New York Jewish Week. He writes articles and essays that have appeared in the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, McSweeney's, and he has a forthcoming novel called The Garbage Guru, which will appear in the Goethe Institute's 200th anniversary publication of the birth of Richard Wagner. So let us welcome Daniel Schifrin.
Yeah. Great. Should we start?
All right.
Can you hear us?
Can you hear me?
So, Gabriella, thank you. That was a great introduction, and I think maybe we'll start by picking up on a couple of the points that she made. And so the first is that this is your third novel, Super Sad True Love Story, and it is the third in which there appears to be a protagonist that bears a striking similarity to you. Was that an accident?
First of all, we have so many differences between Lenny Abramov, the protagonist, and myself. His bald spot is shaped like Ohio.
Right.
Mine is more like West Virginia.
Right.
Or really Virginia at this point. So vastly different people.
Right.
It's a problem. It's the high school teacher telling you, write what you know, and then you really take her up on it for 1,200 pages of literature. So that's a little much. Was it Isaiah Berlin who talked about the fox and the hedgehog? The fox that runs around, and the hedgehog who stays home.
Was that really? Is that what it was? No, was it? Oh, I thought it was I'm not correcting you in the first
Please,
30
what
seconds.
do I know? I mean,
And I don't want to.
I barely know how to read.
No, the fox and the hedgehogs, I think of the fox doing a lot of different things.
Yeah,
running,
the
that's
hedgehog
what you mean.
doing- yeah,
and
that's
the
what I
hedgehog like one thing.
Right. That's what
We're
this
saying
was.
the
This
same
was.
thing.
I was doing.
I see. That's the one thing.
Staying home.
The universal.
This is the hedgehog, right? So I guess becoming a hedgehog-like in my. In Super Sad, at least there was a little bit, a little foxiness because it was told from the point of view of a Jew, and also there was a Korean woman who was his love interest. So that I think expanded the hedgehog-fox dynamic a little bit. But the previous two books were very, about Russian Jews.
You want to talk a little bit more about the book in the sense that it's a novel that is told from the point of view, as you say, of Lenny Abramov diary entries, but also from the point of view of several other characters. And the structure of those characters' conversations is in the form mostly of email.
This book sort of came about when I had trouble with my cable television in New York, and a cable repairman came. And a very young fella, and he's, like Lenny in the book, I have a wall of books. That's my living room. And the fellow came in and said, oh my God, man, why you got all them books here? He was really disgusted by these books. And he said, and such a small TV. So it was this very emasculating kind of dialogue about the size of my TV. And But I also realized in the way he looked at the books that he was really disgusted by how many books there were. And I thought, holy crap, all of a sudden books are not good for a large section of our population. There's something to be ashamed of. And right before that, I was being interviewed by a German from Der Spiegel, a German correspondent, and he went to a hipster bar in New York. It's not hipster anymore, these things go in, but it was called Schiller's on the Lower East Side. And he took out a book, and people were looking at him like some tiger that had escaped from a cage, How dare you bring this disgusting thing into our merriment? We're trying to get drunk and pick up people here. So all these things began to form in my mind as this idea that, books are not what they were when I was growing up. And so when I was thinking of these two characters, I was thinking of a generational shift between them. It's a love story, but Lenny is 39 years old in this book, which in this world is already way over the hill. It's set slightly in the future. And so he's the last sort of reader remaining. In fact, people call him the last reader alive. And he's also one of the last diarists alive, too, somebody who actually jots down his thoughts. And the rest of the book is told, Eunice Park is his love interest. She's a young 24-year-old Korean-American woman. And so everything is done through text messages, emails, that sort of thing. And everything is done through technology. So to research this book, I actually had to dive into technology in a way I never had before. So I hired an intern who was very attractive. Everyone loved him. They called him the man-turn because he was this beautiful, tall. In fact, there's a screenplay being written about him right now called The Man-Turn. And he has a book out, too. So the Man-Turn leapfrogged because of his attractiveness right into the publishing field. And it's a good book. It's about something or other. What was my point? Oh, so yeah. So because of him, I got into technology because to research this book. So we got everything. The latest account, which was then called a Hotmail account. You may have heard of it. When it came out, we bought the iTelephone, joined Facebook when it started, Twitter, all that crap. And so after a while, I began to think in the terms of a modern Al-Quran kind of person. So what happened was I stopped reading books myself because I got so used to quick bursts of information. And I also got used to a kind of thing that you get from Twitter or Facebook, which is that when you write something funny, people appreciate it right away. You don't have to wait 4 years to write this crap. So I became addicted to this stuff as well. And the only thing that broke the addiction was at the time I had a little cottage upstate New York where there was no cell phone reception. So the iTelephone wouldn't pick up any signals from the AT&T. And that's when I started reading again. So in my mind, I was already bifurcated into these two characters myself. Part of me still longed to read books and to go into a place where books mattered, which was my upstate hut. And the other part of me lived in New York and was surrounded just by constant bombardment of digital information. So when I wrote these two characters, that was the interaction between them. It was almost me speaking to me, but from different perspectives.
So do you think after this experience that that the storytelling that happens, the possibilities of storytelling that happen in this new media, Facebook, Twitter, is there something fundamentally different? Did you discover something fundamentally different about how that functions, or is it the same, just more condensed?
Well, brevity matters a lot. And it's interesting because and I find this also, I teach creative writing at the Columbia University in New York. And I find that even when I'm marking students' work, the brevity is in the back of my mind. And I keep thinking, oh my God, this digression is wonderful, but it's too damn long. Who's going to read it? Because I know, professors of literature who are telling me I can't read a 300-page book. It's too hard. So even when I'm looking at work, I'm thinking, well, how do we... So, for example, for a scene, I always say, get in, do what the scene has to do, and get out, instead of how literature used to be structured, which was a long walk through the park, and then a digression on pickles and Coney Island, and then, et cetera, et cetera. It's interesting that in some ways, television serials like The Sopranos or The Wire have continued the tradition of the novel in some ways better than the novel itself, because you have 60, 70 hours in which to tell a story. So you can begin a book the way, you can begin the television series the way novels used to be structured, like Flaubert would take you to the village, introduce you to the character of the mayor, and then the butcher and the fishmonger, et cetera. And you can do that in one of these 60, 70-hour television series. But if you write a book, your editor will be, okay, well, this can go and that can go. And she or he would be right to do that in today's world.
does that mean that you are pessimistic about the future of long-form reading, or are you on the fence, or is it?
It will survive, I think, but I think Philip Roth put it rightly that it will survive as a kind of minority cult. Or as Jonathan Franzen said, fiction, the new poetry, meaning a very small, adorable group of people. I mean, whenever I see readers, my heart just breaks. It's so sweet that people still do this. And in different countries, it's I went to India for a reading a couple of weeks ago. Geez, they haven't heard the news. They still love books, and they think that it's the next big thing. So you go to the reading, and an entire class, first to eighth grade will come. 400 little kids in little uniforms, and they'll touch you like they're touching, an incredible creature. It's unbelievable. It's so sweet.
Well, there's 300 million English-speaking readers. I don't know. I mean, it's a big market.
And it's great because I don't even write these anymore. I just outsource them to India, and then they're read in India. So the cycle is so complete that.
I'm curious to go a little further into the genesis of this book, and there's I guess a generic question I want to ask, which is, so you're a satirist, one could say, and which means that you are poking fun at kind of larger things that happen, including some of the cranberries. What's the
cranberries? Klukva.
The klukva.
Very, very nice.
Yeah, thank you. Klukva. Zdravstvuyte.
Oh, this guy's a genius.
I don't know where that came from.
Language genius.
So you're kind of making fun of these larger things in the culture, in which case you have to kind of have the broad stroke. Yeah. But then you want to get the voice right, you want to get all the details right, so you have to be kind of a close reader and it has to feel very realistic. So I'm wondering, one, how you go up and down those registers, and also you answer this maybe a little bit, but to go deeper into the question of when an idea for a book comes to you, is it generally that there's kind of an idea? You explained with the cable guy, is it the idea that books are going away, or was it kind of the experience of someone having this negative reaction, and that kind of experience, the granular piece of that experience is what actually inspires the movement in the book?
Well, there are ideas in my books, and the cable person was a wonderful sort of step in the right direction. But I think for the most part, I conceive of characters. So a Lenny Abramov type character, somebody who's afraid of death, and somebody who feels like life has already passed him by and he never got to do what he wanted to do. That was a kind of character. Then the idea of a young character, and when I was writing Eunice Park, I thought of her as being one of the smartest people in this brave new world, because she actually thinks and she writes sentences, which nobody does. Lenny calls her my reluctant sentence monger because he's so impressed that she actually puts sentences down on paper. So I thought of what it would be like for the two of them to meet. I was thinking of a dystopia, so I was thinking of 1984 and Brave New World, which everyone always thinks of when they're writing dystopia, but I was thinking how Brave New World is a much more prescient piece of fiction. So much of what Huxley was writing about actually happened. Orwell was not, 1984 is really an exploration of Stalinist Soviet Union in the 40s. So it wasn't that one had to do a huge cognitive leap to come up with that, although he did come up with interesting variations on it. But I remember 1984 more than I do Brave New World, despite the fact that Brave New World has a lot more in terms of ideas going for it. And I think I do that because it's a love story. 1984 is a love story. It's about two people falling in love and a society that holds them apart. And to me, as a writer, you're looking for tension. What will create the most tension? And that is tension. So I came up with the idea of Lenny and Eunice almost in tandem with the idea that books suck. And then I sort of gerrymandered those two into one district.
On the off chance that not everybody has read this book 3 or 4 times, why don't we take just one step back, and do you want to maybe just say a little bit more about kind of the structure of the book, and then you want to maybe you'll read for...
Yeah, I'll read a little bit.
Read a couple passages, and then we'll dive back in.
Best thing about the book is the cover, is spectacular. This was done, we had a focus group come in of young people, because we thought, how do we get young people to read? So we said, hey, do you want to read a book? And they were like, no. And then we said, do you want to read this, because all the colors? And they were like, yeah. So, and they're like, but how do you turn it on? And they kept pressing the buttons, and they're like, if you hold true and press sad, does it turn on? Anyway, it was a multi-dimensional experience for them. And also, if you have a wiener dog like I do, they can play Twister on it. So it's a great cover. So yeah, it's set slightly in the future when a completely illiterate America is about to fall apart, so next Tuesday or so. It's a bit of a political book as well. There's only one party left. It's called the Bipartisan Party. And it's under the leadership of Defense Secretary Rubinstein. So that's my Jewish angle here.
That's right.
I've always wanted to have a Jewish strongman,
Right.
and finally we have one. There's a device called the apparat, which ranks everyone's wealth, attractiveness, and what's called fuckability. Self-explanatory. So the main character is the Russian-American Lenny Abramov. He's the narrator of this section I'm about to read, and he's approaching his 40s. His affability is very low, and he works for a company called Posthuman Services, which is trying very hard to find a cure for death, and it's not going well. And he has a younger Korean-American girlfriend, Eunice Park, and Lenny, as I said, likes to read books. And in this scene that I'm about to read, I love writing about families. I mean, in the end, it's all about either love or families. I mean, what else is there, right? So Lenny's about to take Eunice back to meet his parents, the Abramovs, and they live on Long Island in Westbury, for those of you from Long Island. So this is a little scene. We took a cab to the corner of Washington Avenue in Myron, the most important corner of my life. I could already see my parents' brownish, half-brick, half-stucco cape, the golden mailbox out in front, the faux 19th century lamp beside it, the cheap lawn chairs stacked in the island of cement that was supposed to be the front porch, and the gigantic flags of the United States and Israel billowing from 2 flagpoles. I felt a little embarrassed because I knew that Eunice's parents were much better off than mine. At the door, my mother appeared in her usual household outfit, white bra and panties. She was about to throw her arm around my neck when she noticed Eunice let out some Russian garble of amazement and retreated inside the house, leaving me with the visuals of her thick breasts and white little round of belly. My father, shirtless, soon took her place. Also gasped at Eunice, ran his hand against his naked, muscular breast, said, "Oh!" then hugged me. There was hair against my new dress shirt, the gray carpet of hair that my father wore with an odd touch of class, as if he were a royal in some tropical country. He kissed me on both cheeks, and I did the same, feeling the instructions, the code of Russian father-son relations. Father means I have to love him, have to listen to him, can't offend him, can't hurt him, can't bring him to task for past wrongs. He's an old man now, defenseless. My mother reappeared in shorts and a wife beater. "Synochek, little son," she shouted, "look who's come to visit us, nash lubimets, our favorite." She shook Eunice's hand, and both of my parents swiftly evaluated her, affirmed that she was like her predecessors, not Jewish, but quietly approved of the fact that she was thin and attractive with a healthy black mane of hair. My mother unwrapped her own precious blonde locks from the green handkerchief that kept them safe from the American sun and smiled prettily at Eunice. She began talking in her brave post-retirement English about how glad she was to have a potential daughter-in-law, filling in the contours of her loneliness with rapid-fire questions about my mysterious life in faraway New York City. "Does Lenny keep clean house?" she asked. "Does he vacuum? Once I come to college dormitorium. Oh, awful. Such smell. Dead ficus tree, old cheese on table, socks hanging in window." Eunice smiled and spoke in my favor. He's like very good, Mrs. Abramov," she said. "He's like very clean." I looked at her with love. "I brought Tagamet from the discount pharmacy," I said to my father, taking 5 boxes out of the bag I brought. "Thank you, malinki, little one," my father said, taking hold of his beloved drug. "Peptic ulcer," he said to Eunice, pointing at the depth of his tortured stomach. My mother had already grabbed hold of the back of my head and was madly stroking my hair. "So gray," she said. "So old he gets, almost 40. Lyonya, what is happening to you? Too much stress? Also losing hair. Oh, my God." "You are named Eunice," my father said. "Do you know where it comes from, such name? Like my parents?" "No, not parents. It's from the Greek, eunike, meaning victorious." He laughed, happy to demonstrate that before he was forced to be a janitor in America, he had served as a quasi-intellectual and minor dandy on Moscow's Arbat Street. "So I hope," he said, "that in life you will be victorious also." "Who cares about Greek, Boris?" my mother said. "Look at how she is beautiful." The fact that my parents admired Eunice's looks and capacity for victory brightened me quite a bit. All these years, and I still crave their approval, still long for the carrot and stick of their 19th century child-rearing. I instructed myself to lower the heat of my emotions, to think without the family blood bursting at my temples. But I was 12 years old as soon as I passed the mezuzah at the front door.
So these questions of youth and immortality are large themes in the book. Lenny works at this company where they're trying to keep people alive forever by kind of potchking around with their chemicals and their genes and things like that. I was thinking about the Woody Allen joke that I don't want to live by not dying. By not dying. I don't want to achieve immortality by writing a masterpiece.
Mm-hmm. I want to achieve immortality by not dying is the punchline.
But yeah, exactly. That's the punchline. Never start with a punchline. It's
the worst.
The worst.
Telling,
but I digress. So there's this interesting question of what it means to live forever.
Yeah.
And there's this funny alignment, I think, between this question of immortality in the book and also the potential of immortality of text, which is something that kind of we grew up with the idea that texts live forever,
right.
like the Bible. But that's not necessarily the case anymore.
Yeah, but even so, I mean, it's interesting because people often ask, well, why do you write? And people say, well, I write because I want a part of me to live on forever. Right. Julian Barnes, in one of his latest books, was very good about this. I can't remember the name of the book, but he talked about how even the same thing you mentioned, that even having a book out doesn't mean it will live forever. Text can die. If you look at it further, the planet can die, which is really a much larger question than any of this.
It's awkward.
An awkward little question, especially when you live in Zone A of New York flood zones. But immortality is very vexing for writers, and I think that when I was thinking about this, I was thinking more of the cult of youth, the idea that what do we do as we age? What position do we take in life? Is having children the only way to sort of regenerate, or is there some other way to do it? And I came up with no satisfactory answers. The book is just a bunch of questions.
I'm curious to know a little more, talking about kind of youth and the cult of youth. You teach at Columbia, you teach creative writing. It's mostly to graduate students or only graduate students?
Only graduate students. They won't let me near the undergrads.
Yeah.
I'm too corruptive.
So I'm curious about kind of their experiences reading and kind of understanding text, and whether you're talking about kind of the being the bling of the apparati.
Well, it's very sweet, and someone in the audience is one of my former students. Columbia, or these MFA programs are sort of these little islands of, and there's one here at Stanford, not an MFA program, but the Stegner, obviously the famous Stegner program. They're little islands of sort of where people still read obsessively and discuss these things, even when terribly drunk. After 9 drinks, people can still talk about Faulkner, which is probably how Faulkner should be talked about to begin with. But that's pretty amazing. That's why these programs are, everyone likes to rag on MFA programs, but there's over 400 of them in the United States, and I see them as these little islands where reading takes place. The sad thing is that the reading takes place, but only among people who are also writing. So there may be a point in American history where there will be more writers than readers, which will be awkward. So I'm not afraid of the future of writing in America. I think plenty of writers will be there, and they're really good. They come to us with a lot of skills, but we also, at least in terms of craft, the better programs can do a really good job in training a writer how to achieve their potential. But the question is finding an audience, of course, and you have to go to India for that.
Right, as we've heard.
Or Germany. Oh my God, Germany's the other place where you'll have in reading, and people, millions of people will come, and then they will ask questions like, yeah, okay, so on page 58, your character was wearing a green sweater, but on 63, it's brown. So, okay, yeah, so a book of magical realism I did not buy. And that's so adorable that somebody would actually go to the trouble to diagram your book and be like, green, no, brown. So, God bless him.
God bless him. There's a very funny documentary out about you, a short one about blurbing. Does anyone see that on YouTube? It's a sensation. It's. Do you want to say a word about how that documentary came to be and the metaphysics of blurbing in the context of this discussion?
Well, since I've published my first book, which was 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I've gotten a lot of requests to blurb, and I've blurbed almost every book that's come my way. Blurbs are the little things in the back of the book that say whatever, best book ever. And that's kind of my formula, like the best book on shopping since War and Peace or something like that. It's always these incredibly ridiculous superlatives. But so I'm taking it to a kind of level of performance art, I think. But I've blurred about 150 books at this point, and I continue to blurb incessantly.
Well, you get free books too, right? So that's
Well, yeah, but so more kindling for the fireplace. No, I'm kidding. Mwah, I love these books. They're great. The thicker ones are especially juicy. Fahrenheit 451. So I've blurred because, I think people were really nice to me when I was starting out, and my first book was published because I applied to a program at Hunter College because one of my favorite instructors, Chang-Rae Lee, the Korean-American author, was teaching there. And so I applied to his program, and I went to his office, and he said, we can publish this right now. I'm going to send this to my editor. And 2 weeks later, I had a book deal. And I was so impressed that somebody would go to bat for me like that, that I swore to and he said, just pass this on whenever you can. And so I swore to blurb everything from that point on. Because, these books are pretty damn good overall. I mean, literary fiction, not wrong. And it's nice to I don't know, if at this point this could be self-defeating. I think sometimes people see my blurb like, oh God, one of those, but people still ask for it. So if the marketplace can support more of my blurbs, I'll continue to do so. So if anyone has a book here, just send it to me.
Yeah,
Blurb the hell out of it.
So connecting it maybe a little bit more to the conference on the future of Jewish storytelling, there's this interesting question of voyages and journeys in all of your books, and kind of going back and forth between languages, but more kind of between continents. And so in the Russian Debutante's Handbook, your first book, it's Vladimir, right?
Vladimir, yeah.
Vladimir, exactly. Vladimir.
Okay, Vladimir, whatever.
Vladimir.
Whatevs.
So Vlad, he comes to this
V-man.
V-man.
Vuh.
He comes to the States as a kid, and he doesn't find the American dream that he expected. He's an intern at Hayes in New York, or just it's not happening to him. Yeah. It's happening to him. It's not happening for him. So he decides that he's going to go back to Europe, and he goes to Prada, which is basically a kind of a slightly imagined Prague, and there he discovers the American dream in some way. And I was really struck by that, and I'm just wondering about this issue of how the story and the journey are connected, in the sense that we think of these big epic stories as being built on some kind of journey or transformation.
Yeah.
You come to this country, immigrant literature. Once you're here, do you have to make another journey like that in order to kind of keep that story moving?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, it's a good question. I came to America when I was about 7 years old, and people always ask me, do you remember anything from Russia? The shocking thing is, I remember almost everything. I mean, it is so ingrained in my mind, everything that happened there. And then when I came to America, things kind of got much worse because it was 1980, 1979. It was Reagan's Evil Empire speech. So we were all, the movies were Red Dawn, Red Gerbil, Red Hamster. Everything was, So being a Russian really sucked. Especially, I went to a Hebrew school where I had to pretend I was born in East Berlin. It was better to be a German in Hebrew school than a Russian. I mean, it made no sense, So I actually remembered Russia fondly because I never went to school in Russia. I was very sick. I had asthma, like all Russian boys, and it was, And I had a grandmother who we left behind, and she died in Russia because she was very ill. She couldn't move. But she was a journalist, and she worked for Evening Leningrad. This is one of the newspapers in Leningrad, and she commissioned a book for me, and it was about Lenin. I loved Lenin. There was a big statue of Lenin outside of her house.
Commissioned a book when you were 7?
No, I was 4 or 5.
Okay.
Yeah. And she paid me in little slices of cheese for each page I wrote. So this glowing Soviet cheese was my inspiration. And I still get paid in cheese. Random House is very cheesy in that way. And so I wrote a book. It was called Lenin and His Magical Goose. And it was about Lenin meets this goose, and they invade Finland together to foment a socialist revolution in Finland. And then they have like a kind of Menshevik-Bolshevik argument, and Lenin eats the goose. And I remember my grandmother was like, that you shouldn't know. Because she was a good Bolshevik herself. It's just stop it when they conquer Finland. And that was the first sort of love I experienced, unconditional love, and it was related to writing, you know. And it was like 100 pages. I mean, each page gigantic Cyrillic letters, but still, it really was something wonderful. And I never grew up technically in the Soviet Union. I left at 7, but the children's lives in that part of time were not so bad in the 70s for children. You know, there was a lot of, we would go to the Crimea and Yalta and all these beautiful places, and the memories were quite good, except for a few of them, mostly related to my illnesses. But there was something, I always thought of that as home, which most people when they move at age 7 don't think of where they left as home. People even at older ages adapt very quickly, especially to America, which just gobbles up everything and produces the same wonderful consumerist stuff that we love. But for me, it was never, and the other thing my parents did is they never had a television until I was about 12. And that meant I had nothing to relate to because everything in school was about television. And they only spoke Russian in the house, and there was only Russian books. I remember at a parents-teachers conference in Hebrew school, one teacher said, we hear Gary's very smart, he reads Tolstoy in the original. And my father said, nah, only Chekhov. So that was you know. So I both resented my parents for that because I wanted to fit in, and what they were clearly positioning me as was some red nerd, you know. But then I made a whole thing out of it. So
right.
It worked out. Thanks, Mom and Dad.
Hebrew school, Germans. So your books feel very Jewish. Do you feel very Jewish? How Jewish are you?
Depends where I am. At the Stanford Jewish Center,
Yeah.
I'm really Jewish.
Yeah.
At Georgetown, not so much. But it's funny, but the Jewish thing follows you around. I mean, even in India, I was put on a Jewish panel.
With who?
Andrew Solomon, another Jew,
Okay.
and some other Jew, Howard Jacobson,
Okay.
the British Jew.
Oh, yeah.
So it's British
he's funny.
Jew, Russian Jew, gay Jew was the
Okay.
kind of the arc. Great. Well, I don't give it. Hey, look, literature's in such bad shape that Jewish, Russian,
Right.
New York, whatever you want, I'll cop to anything. I don't care. I was once at a panel with Jeffrey Eugenides, and he said, "You're so lucky because at least you'll always have some audience with Jews in the book." It's
Right.
like I'm Greek. What do I got? He said that, not I. So
Yeah.
I can. But I love Greeks.
Well, they have that Homer thing.
They got Homer, yeah, and The Simpsons and everything.
Yeah. One reason I ask is there's in the book the location of Lenny's workplace is in this old synagogue.
Yeah.
That it feels like it's like Central Synagogue. I don't know if there
No,
was
it's the Park Avenue Synagogue.
Park Avenue Synagogue.
I wrote it because my analyst is next door to it. So
Okay, that's
I
great.
see it every day, from one temple
Great.
to another.
You are so Jewish.
And then me and all the other analyzed Jewish writers get together at Cafe Sabarsky for Kaffee mit Schlag. I mean, where do you go from there?
Yeah, you come here. So this place where they work, I don't really know what happens there. People move around all their genes and things like that. I don't really understand science. But it's a synagogue, and there seems to be some symbolism in having this kind of, messianic, apocalyptic, we're going to live forever, the culture's going to die, stuff happen in the synagogue. Is that is there anything there to unpack for you in terms of this being like the temple of this story?
Well, as a child, as a very sickly child, I was very afraid of death, obviously, and I was always afraid that my parents would die in America and I'd be left alone with bad English and bad hair and all that. So I was very afraid of death. So I always thought that religion was about immortality. And we had Soviet Jews used to be funneled through Italy before they came to America. Hayes was nice enough to pay for half a year of really good living in Italy. And I remember walking into St. Peter's or into any cathedral and sort of being struck by angels and the idea that there was life everlasting. I never quite bought it, but I really wanted it to be that way because I was so scared of death. And I remember when I was in Hebrew school, the one question I really had for the rabbis, I couldn't care about the Talmud or anything else was going on, but what's going to happen when I die? And there were many interpretations, but one was nothing, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. And I was like, what a great religion. Jeez, we got to work on this aspect if we're going to brand this, And the other was some complicated things, some netherworld where a goat is tied to a stake or something. It was unbelievably bad. Worst heaven ever. But the idea that religion is about immortality is nothing new, obviously, but in my child mind, it really stuck. And so, so I go to my analyst and we talk about the here and now, obviously, and then next door to it is this synagogue that is, in some ways, perhaps, it has these stained glass windows that make it almost cathedral-like, as so much of architecture in synagogues in New York is. So for me, it was a very natural progression to set a book about immortality within that space.
I have a couple more questions, and I want an opportunity to open up for people to ask questions and have their comments also. So,
or complaints.
Or complaints is great. So again, thinking about this idea of the future and the future of Jewish storytelling, and these kind of, your last two novels, Absurdistan and Super Sad, are both these kind of slightly in the future, or?
Absurdistan is not. Absurdistan is set at exactly in 2001.
That's true. It's but you kind of play around with the idea of it's a country. It's kind of a made-up country.
Yeah.
You're giving yourself, even though it's set in today, you're giving yourself some freedom to kind of do whatever you want. But in both novels, things that you had said satirically, they're things that came to pass, which makes you a kind of a prophet, oracle. I'm not sure what word to use. Do you want to say a word about some of those prophecies that came true?
It's really kind of insane. Super sad. But the thing is, I'm not like Huxley, a prophet of 50 years from now. I'm a prophet of like 2 weeks from now.
Right.
I'll give you an example. I mean, in Super Sad, young women wear transparent jeans, leaving nothing to the imagination. 2 months after the book came out, there was a Paris runway show featuring transparent jeans. Almost all the technology in this book, including Google Glass, has come out. The Occupy Wall Street movement, which is sort of in this book, happened about a year after the book came out. What else? A lot of the stuff, the technological advances toward immortality are actually happening, including smart blood, which is the idea that the blood flows and you don't even need a heart; it just knows where to go, because the heart is very, problematic. So, both literally and figuratively. Yeah, it's shocking. A lot of it did come true very, and the reason I said a book in the future is because things happen so fast right now that it's impossible to write about the present. There's no present left. When Tolstoy was writing War and Peace, he was writing, it was 50, 60 years had elapsed, but a horse was a horse and a carriage, and, the Industrial Revolution was starting, but still you could get away with things. But how do you write about anything today? Because it's gone by the end of the day. So setting in the future was my sort of insurance, was my way of writing about the present. And it's true, almost all happened.
Talking about the future, you are working on another book, which is different than previous ones. What are you at liberty to say about that?
Well, it's a memoir.
Right. And
how will I ever show my face in literary society again?
Who's the protagonist?
You, actually.
Yeah, yes.
It's a complicated twist there. Well, I'm 40. I just turned 40. And, in my family, men drop at 56. Infarct, the heart attack in Russian. So I got 16 years to settle things.
Okay.
So I'm starting to tell my story.
Okay.
Also, you get tired of writing about Russian Jews. And with a memoir, you kind of clear the deck because you give it all away. So there's nothing left. So then I'll have to write about a wasp or something. So I'd like to meet one. I'll have to leave New York, but that's why God made Indiana.
We'll open it up. And what do you want people to do? You want them to take the microphone, come down to the microphone, yell really loudly, some combination?
They should raise their hand, and then someone will bring
this gentleman here.
So I have a question about humor in your books. So you're funny, your books are funny, the characters are funny, and I'm curious about the role you see humor playing in the books, and then also, is the humor ever a trade for you?
A trade.
A trade. For example, you want to build tension. Do you have to trade that for humor? Do you sometimes hold back and say, wait, I know this joke, I'm going to pull it back?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I haven't thought of it that way. Is humor a trade sometimes that you realize, especially because my books do have plots, unlike many other books, is there a trade-off in having the humor be so at the forefront when you're, Absurdistan, and this book too, I mean, hundreds of people die throughout these books that are killed in horrible ways, so humor is, but that's sort of the Russian Soviet Jewish humor, I think, which is this kind of humor from the edge of the grave. You're dealing with things that are so absurd and ridiculous. The first thing I remember ever as a child was a Brezhnev joke that my parents told me. It was the 1980 Olympics, and Brezhnev, who's completely senile at this point and barely alive, has to give the opening address at the Olympics. So he gets up on the podium and looks at the papers and he starts reading his, oh, whoa, whoa. And his assistant runs up and says, Comrade General Secretary, those were the Olympic rings. And I love that joke because it's performative, it's funny, it's political, it's stupid. I mean, it's everything you want it to be, So when I think of humor, that's sort of the role I want in the book, is something that, and when I write it, I read out all the dialogue to myself to make sure that it sounds right, which is something like when I teach, that's my one sort of pet peeve is, if you write dialogue, make it sound like real dialogue instead of what you think writers are supposed to sound like when they're doing dialogue. What was the first part of your question? Humor. Humor, good.
Humor.
Oh, yeah. And the other thing is, I guess, that also that, I see writing as a form of entertainment also, which is verboten in many intellectual and MFA type circles where fiction is seen as a serious enterprise that either experiments with language in a new way or tells us some truth that we haven't yet discovered. And I'm fine with both of those things, and I hope I do some of them in my books. But if I write a book that is not entertaining, well, that I feel like I failed in some way because you've invested, your 9 hours and your $15 US, and I feel like I'm not doing right by you if I don't at least make you laugh at some point.
Thank you. Happy birthday.
Oh, thank you.
We have a question over here.
There's a long tradition of Jewish immigrant humor. What I'm hearing from you is much different than I remember from my father and his generation in terms of the immigrant humor. How do you fit into the stream of Jewish immigrant humor?
Well, it's a different stream in the sense that I emigrated from a country that no longer exists, with many Jewish immigrants who emigrated from Tsarist Russia. I guess that experience was similar.
Very much so.
Very much so. But I think there's just, I don't want to make this statement completely, but I feel that it's almost sort of more desperate humor in the sense that the view of the world as a whole today, for me and for many in my generation and younger generations, is a very frightened one. It's not just the political paralysis that worries us. It's the fact that during the Cold War, annihilation was so quick that nobody would dare to do it. Nobody would press that button. But we are, I feel, slowly dying as a planet, which is very sad, and which requires a whole different level of humor to deal with. Nathaniel Rich, who's a very interesting writer, the son of Frank Rich, too, the columnist, is publishing the first global climate book, novel, which is set slightly in the future and is about the death of Manhattan in a way, and it's coming out in April. So I think our priorities are global. I think the humor is also much more global because it's almost like the immigrant novel no longer exists the way it used to because the immigrant had to get on a ship and sail back to Norway or Belarus, and who the hell wanted to do that, But now you get on a plane, 9 hours later you're in Moscow. So it feels like the immigrant novel where you came to America and this was your life, no longer exists. It's much more of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And that creates a different dynamic. You feel really bifurcated. When I write, I have a Russian soundtrack, at least when the dialogue comes in, and when the humor as well. Some of the humor, I'm surprised that some Americans like it because it's I think, almost verbatim the kind of humor I grew up with.
Except if you take the immigrant humor, the fear of the Tsar was always there in terms of their fear at their time compared with
That
your
was the fear
fear
of the sequester, yes.
at this time. Yeah.
Yeah. Bring back the Tsar. He was a good
Yeah.
person to fear.
Yeah.
Hi. It's a question about your view of the here and now, since the book is futuristic and dystopian, but then you read it, and every time you read about something in the future, realize that it's all around us. It's one of the things that came out already is the pervasiveness of technology and the short attention span. And the other thing that struck me was pornography, and pervasiveness of pornography. So would you comment about what you think is here and now, whether it's something you predict is going to happen 2 weeks from now?
Well, pornography is here now. I have a lot of assurance that that's true. I was on Terry Gross's Fresh Air, and she started asking me about pornography, and I almost melted on the microphone. I don't know why. I mean, everyone talks about it. The idea of pornography was simply that, that it's not just, in the future, it's not just prevalent, but even children are exposed to it, that everyone is exposed to it. It's just a part of life. And the idea is that there's a desensitization about non-pornographic modes of loving somebody else. So in this digital pornographic world, how does love survive? What form does it take when everyone has a numerical value as to their sexability and everything else? And that's a question that I thought of a lot when I wrote it. I remember the one sweet thing about Hebrew School I remember was that the whole school fell in love with Brooke Shields for some reason. Maybe she said something nice about Israel, I don't know. And there was a People magazine with a fold-out of Brooke Shields lying on a beach. And she was almost fully clothed. It was this ginormous outfit, but still, this was our pornography, the idea that... And every student was given 1 day with her to take her home. And I remember, I could barely speak English, but I put Brooke Shields under my bed, and I kind of communed with her. And that was sweet, and then I thought of the fact that today any child with any computer sense, despite their parents' best intention, can access the most advanced form of pornography, and I'm not against pornography, I mean, whatever people want, but it's just that the difference in terms of growing up and maturation is so different that this book, I think, takes on a more nostalgic tone toward that.
Have you or do you go back to Russia at all? And if so, what do you think about what's going on there?
Yeah, I go back to Russia almost every year, although today I read of a campaign to deny me the Russian visa when I go back, so Russia's getting its act together finally and hoping to stop me from entering. Well, Russia's always the same, that's what's so great about it. It's always the same thing. I went to a restaurant called 1913 in Petersburg, and I said, "Why 1913?" And the woman said, "It was the last good year in Russian history." That seemed about right. So, Russia. The last thing about banning adoptions to America, that was amazing, because that took it to a whole new level of cruelty, and that really made you realize that this country will stop at nothing, and the powers that be will stop at nothing to promulgate their hold on power and their idea of what Russia should be. So I don't predict a lot of good things for the country. I travel a lot around the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China. I'm fascinated by how they grow, and I think even China with its Communist Party has maybe a better future than Russia in many respects, demographically and in other ways. And India, which is a democracy, a very poor one, but I think if it gets its acts together, it will be something else. And Brazil is just wonderful. So I was born in the wrong BRIC.
Can I ask you 2 questions?
2, okay. Yeah.
So I was struck by you saying that you considered Russia to be your home, at least when you were younger. And I've also heard you say that you considered New York your home, that if any place is your home, it's New York. So I'm wondering if there is one place that you consider to be your home, or if you believe that you even have one at all.
I am such a rootless cosmopolitan. Yeah, Russia to begin with, then New York City, but then now I spend half my time in the countryside because I'm fleeing urbanity. So I like the idea of constantly just moving from place to place. My parents did it. Why can't I? You know, I love suitcases. I love lugging one behind me. I feel good in airport lounges. I think, I mean, we invented the whole. I mean, we are the diaspora, and I think it's lovely not to have a home, not to have a country to, you know, to call home.
I'm really glad you said that, because I actually talk about your characters as being rootless cosmopolitans. But I'm very interested in how you represent the Russian Jewish immigrant experience. But what I constantly bump up against is that you don't represent the Russian Jewish immigrant experience. And your characters are not typical immigrants, right? In Russian Debutantes, it's all about going back to Eastern Europe, and in Absurdistan, it's the son of an oligarch who doesn't really need to immigrate in the way that Russian refugees used to come to America, for example. And then in Super Sad True Love Story, the character's not really, or he is an immigrant, but he came here when he was really young and is assimilated. So is that a conscious choice on your part to deal with immigration through these very unconventional, imagined persons?
Well, there's a mourning dove outside my window, and I always throw him a piece of bread, and he's very suspicious of me and the bread, and he kind of pecks around it, and he goes around in circles and circles and circles and circles, and then he finally gets to the bread after ascertaining that no one's going to hurt him for eating the bread. And I think, in a way, my books have done that. I keep trying to get closer to some kind of truth. I want to do it in an entertaining fashion. I think the memoir is as close to the truth. It is the truth. I mean, that's what I want it to be. I want it to be a very, it'll hopefully still be funny, etc. But I want it to be a very honest reckoning of what it's been like to be me, as much of an honest reckoning as I can get to of what it's like to be my parents. Because frankly, all this stuff has been an enterprise to understand them better. All these books, all these return trips to Russia. I mean, most people just don't, you know, they'll say, fine, I don't care. I'm just going to work for Google, which is great. I want to do that too. God, give me a job. But the books have been, in some ways, an enterprise in trying to figure out what all this is about. Why this anxiety, depression, humor, all the positives and negatives that I've been saddled with. And hopefully the memoir will clear the decks a little bit for me, and so I can attempt to do some other kind of project. Or retire to Florida, which would be even better.
I'm glad you gave that answer, because this person you would have to rewrite your thesis, right? If,
I'll mold my books to your thesis. So tell me what you want, and I'll do it.
Dodged a bullet.
So I have a question about balance. Coming from an immigrant background and the scene you read so well, bringing a girlfriend into the home was always filled with landmines. If I were to try to write something like that in a truthful way, it would almost be indecipherable to an American audience. I'd have to dial it back and at least have a little bit more English, a little bit more cultural affinity to the United States to make it tenable, readable. Do you feel that you have to, or what scale do you need to have of a Russian feel in order to satisfy you and still make it palatable and desirable to an American audience?
Yeah, no, this is the question that all immigrant authors or all bicultural authors ask, to what extent do I write for an audience, to what extent do I write for myself? I don't want to make things more complicated than they have to be. Interesting, Junot Diaz, the wonderful Dominican writer, talks about how his books are just laden with Spanish, and he talks about how he wants to make the reader feel almost like an immigrant, the way he felt when he came to America, feel like an immigrant and trying to decipher what the books are. I don't quite go that far, but I think that the Russian language that I grew up with, the ones my parents spoke, which was filled with curses and just very colorful language. They were not, they maybe thought of themselves as intellectuals, but they presented themselves as people who had some kind of, close relationship with guttural language. So I wanted to use all of that. And you have to explain it a little bit to the American audience, but I remember when my first book came out, the Russian, whatever, Debutante, it was like 11 years ago, and Russians would come to me and say, okay, we get it, but what American is ever going to get that? And I think maybe, and the one, I'm happy to have readers who have continued on from one book to another. I hope to at least explain to them more of what, it could be said, klukva, it could be said as somewhat stereotypical, but this is the Russians that I knew growing up, and this is the curses I knew growing up. So I just want to share it with the wider audience.
Do we have time for maybe one more question?
There are all of these Russian-born emigre writers out there, United States, Canada, Germany, Israel, and to what extent, well, this is a phenomenon, but to what extent do you feel you're part of something bigger in that regard, or is this you're just doing what you're doing and you just happen to be who you are doing what you're doing?
I just happen to be who I am doing what I'm doing. There's not much camaraderie. I mean, we know each other. I like some of them. I like Bismazgis, who's in Canada. Anya Yulinich is a very funny writer. But there's not a sense that we're all in this together. The way, for example, Bellow and Roth, where, Bellow in some ways was passing the torch on to Philip Roth. I try to blurb every Russian book that comes away, but then again, I blurb every book, so it's not very specific. And what interests me, when I wrote my first book, one of the reasons I was so scared of sending it out was because there were no Russian books from my generation of Russian immigrants. It was the first. After it, a whole bunch of books came out. But I was very afraid of what my parents would say. I don't even want to say community because it really isn't. I mean, they don't live in Brighton Beach or anything like that, but I was very worried about things like that. And that kept me from sending it out and sending it to Changri Lee, who then got it published. In fact, it was my first shrink who told me, you can't just sit on this book, you got to send it somewhere. But I was very embarrassed about it, and but I was so amazed that there were no Russians of my generation. This was 2001, because there were Bengali, Dominican, Korean, Chinese, so many great authors representing almost everything, and it felt bizarre that Russia, which I still think 19th century Russian literature is the best literature in the world, that we had nothing to represent us in this country. And what then surprised me as these books, and again, I love a lot of these books, but the fact that there is a dearth of comedy and satire is also something that surprised me, given the fact that these were predominantly Russian Jews with a very evolved sense of humor, or at least theoretically. So I just want to bring the humor back into what I think is a great literature.
So, Gary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
If I remember correctly, you're going to stay here, and people can buy books.
I'll sign anything, even other people's books.
Okay.
Yeah.